Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. And if anyone tells me that the Scottish climate is terrible again, I would just say rubbish, because the sun has shone, blue sky since I've been here. So thank you for giving me great weather as well. Okay. I usually divide this talk into three parts. At first, I'm going to talk about some of the concerns and some of the issues. Then I'll go on to some of the evidential data that we have about what's happening in Australia and, provide that. And then when you're suitably depressed, I'm going to then give you some information about what Australian communities are doing about it. So if you're feeling a bit down, the good bit's yet to come. And I'm hoping I can do this technology. Yeah. Just before we start, I thought it was important that we all know what we're talking about. There are a number of unconventional gas forms. Shale and tight gas are the most commonly known. Shale and coal beds, methane. And then, of course, there's also tight gas. Shale gas, which I gather you have deposits here as well, uses an incredible amount of water to do hydraulic fracturing, and you always have to hydraulic fracturing. Coal bed methane doesn't use as much water, but it produces a huge amount of water because you've got to depressurise the seam to allow the gas to run freely. You'll often hear industry say, well, it's coal bed methane, we don't need to frack. Well, what you do need to do is wait for the little bit at the end of the sentence which says, yet. Because basically a gas well, coal bed methane gas well, will last about 7 years. But the bulk of the gas is gone within the first 12 to 18 months. And so when the pressure starts to drop after the dewatering, then the company will come back and say, oh, by the way, pressure's gone down, we do need to hydraulically frack. I should just mention everything that I'll talk about is in this brief, which you can also download from our website. So you don't need to take notes unless you want to make a comment about your questions. I'm sure everybody here knows what hydraulic fracturing is, but just in case, it basically is putting down into the well at high pressure, large volumes of water, chemical additives, proppants, which I'll describe in a second, and sometimes radioactive traces. So that sort of gets the definition issue. Tight gas, which you may also hear the industry refer to sometimes, is just simply methane, which is caught in limestone or sandstone rather than shale or coal. That up there, that photo to your right, is a gas field in southern Queensland, southeast Queensland. It's called the Tyra gas field. I'm sure some of you have seen it on websites, but it gives you a bit of an idea what a gas field can look like. So what are our shared environmental concerns? And I'll explain why I'm calling them shared in a second. They centre around water, not only water contamination issues, but how you deal with your wastewater, because coal bed methane produces large amounts of produced water, that's the wastewater from the well, every day, around 0.1 to 0.8 megalitres per day. There's issues to do with water equity. In Australia, when they dewater the seam, and because there are so many wells, what is happening is the groundwater table is being lowered. So many farmers who had access to bores and were able to use the bores to water their property simply do not have access anymore because the groundwater table has reduced sometimes up to 60 to 100 metres. So it really puts it out of the ability for a farm to drill a well. So there's a whole issue to do with water contamination, water equity. The issue to do with chemicals, which is what I'll talk about a lot tonight because, that's my specialty, that's what got me into this issue in the first place. It's not only the identity of them, but it's the quantity, it's the issue of mixtures, how we deal with that. And I think it's important to stress it's not just fracking chemicals, it's drilling chemicals as well. And then, of course, there's air pollution. When we met with some of the members of Parliament in London, they were quite surprised that we even talked about air pollution. What air pollution? Why is this an issue? Well, I'll show you some evidence later as to exactly why it is an issue. And it's not just the methane, which is a greenhouse gas, produce also volatile organic compounds, which some are carcinogens, some are neurotoxins, affecting the way, say, children develop, and some are endocrine disruptors. There's a range of other contaminants in air, which I'll mention at the end, and of course wastes. The industry produce large amounts of waste. Drilling muds, when you drill a whole lot of wells, you have a whole lot of drilling muds and drilling cuttings, which then have to be dealt with, disposed of. Again, of course, you've got the produce water as well. Why I say shared environmental concerns is it's not just environment organisations, academics, health people that are concerned. The United Nations Environment Programme, which is a very august body, a well-respected body, late last year put out an environmental global alert on this industry. Now, that's quite significant. They don't put out these alerts very often. And what they said in that alert was that the unconventional gas exploration and production may have unavoidable environmental impacts. Some will occur when the technology is used incorrectly. Others will occur even when the technology is used correctly. And what they basically say there is that you can't regulate this industry into safety. You can't regulate away all the risks. Their concerns about it are the same as ours: air pollution, water issues, water equity, public health issues, and I'll deal with those in a little bit more detail. The photo there is a sump from a bore of a colleague of mine, a friend, who has a property where he runs cattle. He has about 2,000 hectares. He used to have a very healthy, good bore that produced beautiful, clean water, which he had used for many years. The industry started to work in his area. His bore collapsed, just basically collapsed. They heard a large sound, a large noise, went there, no more water in the bore, and it had fallen in on itself when they put the cameras down. The industry came in and drilled him a new bore, and that is basically a sump collecting the water from that bore, and as you can see, he can light it. We don't light taps in Australia, we light bores, and we have the data now of that bore showing that it is contaminated with methane and toluene. That's just a picture of a drill pad in Australia, just to give you an idea of what one looks like. Sometimes you'll often be told these are very little sites, quite benign, you won't notice them. Well, unfortunately, you do notice something like that. That's coal bed methane. Because in Australia, shale is on the other side of the country, a good 5-hour flight, I couldn't get a shot of a drill pad from shale, so I've used one of the Marcellus ones, but you can see they're pretty similar, they look pretty similar. On to the chemical additives. As I said, it's really important not to forget the drilling fluids. Some of them are quite toxic and corrosive. They are the same drilling fluids as used in traditional conventional gas, but the difference is in conventional gas, you drill one well, or maybe two. You don't drill dozens or scores or hundreds of them. The fracking fluids you will often hear from the industry, and I know the industry here is saying they won't frack, but I think it's important that you be prepared, because I really don't know many coal bed methane wells that don't get fracked eventually. You'll often hear the industry say, well, it's very dilute, very small amounts of chemicals. Less than 2% of the water that goes down is chemical additives. But when you actually go through the industry literature, which is something I do, strangely enough, that actually translates into big figures. For coal bed methane, in one of the industry documents that I reviewed, 18,500 kilograms of chemical additive per well per fracture. So each time they fracture, and a well can be fractured up to 10 times. Of that, anything up to 40–50% may not be recovered. That is, it remains in the ground. When we looked at some shale wells in Australia, it was around 8 tonnes to 15 tonnes of chemical additive per well per frac. And we knew we were in the right ballpark because when we looked at the EU report that came out last year, they talked about 16 tonnes of chemical additive, acute toxic chemical additive for tight gas. So, you know, we're all talking about the same ballpark. When we look at these chemicals, I know people are quite shocked when I tell them this, but the vast majority have not been assessed. Unfortunately, in the industrial chemical world, unlike pesticides, which usually are quite regulatorily assessed, industrial chemicals, only a handful of our typical industrial chemicals have gone through a regulatory process. In my own country, of the 23 most commonly used chemicals in fracking and drilling, only 2 had ever gone through a regulatory process, and neither of them had been assessed for their use in these types of uses like fracking and drilling. When a company uses a product, it gets what's called a material or manufacturer safety data sheet, which is a sheet for the product, not for the chemical. So when CEPA says to me, but we know all the chemicals that are being used, and I say, well, how do you know that? And they say, because the companies tell us. And you say, well, what does the company tell you? Well, they've got material safety data sheets. And you say, that's fine, that's the identity of the product. On a material safety data sheet, you may get 10% of the ingredients disclosed, sometimes you may get 50%, but you never get 100% of the ingredients disclosed. And the rest of it is basically claimed as trade secrets or confidential business information. Still, many of the products they use, the material safety data sheet, carry warnings for short-term or long-term health effects. The vast majority have very little environmental fate data and next to no ecotox data, which simply means that we are using products that we have very little knowledge about what they do when you release them into the environment. Probably how you would describe it is that we have an unassessed mixture of carcinogens, cancer-causing chemicals, neurotoxins, and endocrine disruptors, and a range of other things. In 2011, the New York University came out with a study on the chemicals used in the industry and said that at least a number of them were dangerous at levels below or at levels of detection, which really means where we can stop testing for them, they can have their impact below that. And I mentioned proppants earlier. Again, you'll often hear the industry say, well, it's only sand. Well, in a way, it's only sand, it's silica. And unfortunately now, it's also these newly man-made created polymers. But if we just stuck with the silica, last year, the US NIOSH and OSHA, that's the Occupational Safety and Health people, put out an alert for workers who work with hydraulic fracturing, basically alerting them to the fear and risk of developing silicosis, which is a particularly nasty lung disease. I don't expect you to read those, you can pick them up, some of them, but I often get told, or I hear industry telling communities, don't worry, this is the sort of stuff you would find in your kitchen cupboard or under the bathroom sink or etc. And I would just like to pop those up to show you, these are the most commonly used ones. Nothing could be further from the truth. These are serious chemicals. Some, as I say, cause cancer. In the US, when they did a self-reporting of industry, industry reported that 1 out of every 3 frac they did used a carcinogen. There's reproductive toxins. Some of them, like the ethoxylated nonylphenols, have now been classified by the EU as very toxic to, very hazardous to aquatic organisms. So, you know, just to give you an idea that these are not soft, benign stuff. They'll often claim the guar gum. It's all right, this is what we put in ice cream. But what they fail to mention is there is 2 grades of guar gum. There's food grade guar gum, and there's industrial guar gum. And last year, or sorry, no, the year before last, the EU rejected a load of guar gum coming from India because it was contaminated with pentachlorophenol, which is another toxic product. Sorry if I'm using all these names, I find it difficult not to. The industry also releases a lot of natural contaminants as well. That is, products that are, or compounds that are down under the ground. They're safe when they're down there, there's no exposure. But they release them through their drilling and through their hydraulic fracturing. The contaminants aren't a problem unless you've got an exposure pathway or practices that allow you to be exposed. And I would suggest that the industry have many of those practices. as I said, they produce a lot of produced water. I've also found out here you don't call it produced water. I like to call it wastewater, which is what it is. But here they're referring it to as returned water. Now, I'm not sure if that is because it sounds nice, so returned water, it's come home to mummy. But anyway, it is contaminated. It produces, CSG produces a huge amount per day, contaminated with the things we've just discussed, and you've got to do something with it. Unfortunately, that's one way we deal with it in Australia. We spray it on roads for dust suppression. It's very common in the US as well. I'm told it will never happen here in the UK, which is good. But then they also tell me that it's not going to go to ponds. These massive 20 hectare ponds where they put produced water, both in Australia and the US. So it's not going to go to ponds, it's not going to be re-injected into the aquifer, which I'm very pleased about, and it's not going to be used for dust suppression. So I asked the authorities, what is it going to do? Where are you going to put this water? And I think I got a bit of what we would call the stunned mullet look of, I don't know. But that's a big issue. I don't know how you're going to manage all this produced water. You cannot treat it to absolute cleanliness. The most common way of treating is a thing called reverse osmosis. In Australia, the reverse osmosis industry will happily say we cannot remove all the low molecular weight chemicals that are used by the industry. So you have this partially treated water which you've got to manage, and you've got megalitres of it. In Australia, in a very cynical move, I've got to say, what the industry is now doing for those farmers who have lost access to their water because the water table has dropped so low, the industry is now offering them produced water back, saying, well, look, you're in need of water, have some of ours. What they also offer them is a confidentiality agreement that allows them to not give any guarantees of quantity or quality, and an agreement that wipes out all liability for the companies. So if there's any problem down the track with contamination of their soil or of their cattle or of their any other farming produce, it's their problem, not the companies. There are other processes which allow exposure, and that is things like hydraulic fracturing, land filling of wastes. As I said, with the drilling muds, there's so much of it. Again, what do you do with it? We are using it in Australia as soil conditioning on farms, which horrifies me no end, because it is contaminated with heavy metals, albeit at low levels, but heavy metals don't go away, they build up, they're persistent. I hope that never happens here, but then again, what will the industry do with all of its drilling muds? And when the cost of sending it to hazardous waste landfill builds up, when the cost of just dealing with that in landfill, it's going to have a solution. Then, of course, there's all the venting of gases, which I will come to, and the fugitive emissions, which just mean the leaks and the releases and the ones that are done when it's not intentional. There's flaring, and of course the transport, because that's another big issue. If you're not going to put your produced water and your wastes in holding ponds and in various things, then you're going to have to transport it off-site, which means hundreds of truck movements, and I mean hundreds. And these aren't little trucks, these are big tankers. I popped that up there just to demonstrate my argument about the fact that you cannot treat the water to a clean level. This is a wastewater permit. It's over and done with now. It ended halfway through last year. And you can see these are only some of the chemicals. There are about 60 or so. You can see the release rates. And at that release rate, you can look onto the right-hand column and see the tonnage of contaminant that would be released with it. In Australia, that was going into a local river. Here, I would imagine it would go into, let me hope I get it right, the Firth of Forth. Is that right? No, probably not. But anyway, you know what I mean. So, even though you can have release rates that are quite low, they can be within acceptable levels, when you do it for a period of time, for 18 months, that's the type of accumulative load that you can get. So, that's the end of the hypotheticals, and I'd just now like to look at some of the data that we have. I start off with the US EPA one because it's one of the really good studies that we have got on drinking water wells. This came about because residents were complaining about smells and bad tastes in their water. They drink a lot of underground water in the States. And in Wyoming, this one came from. The EPA went in 2011. This study wasn't released until late last year because of industry pressure. And basically they tested for a range of compounds and found, I can't even remember exactly, but it was around 40 or so compounds within the water, and they concluded that chemicals related to hydraulic fracturing had found their way into aquifers that were used for drinking water. In my own country in Queensland, Arrow Energy, which is a big CSG company, had to acknowledge they had contaminated their monitoring water bores with BTEX, and benzene, which is a carcinogen, was found at 6 and 15 times the drinking water standard. I was involved in some testing of a wellhead 24 hours after it was fracked, and we came back with a range of volatile organic compounds or semi-volatile organic compounds and heavy metals. And the bore that I showed you burning at the beginning, that was tested by the industry, and it came back contaminated with toluene and methane. The image there is what's called a blowout. And of course industry will tell you they never ever happen. But that is a blowout of Western Sydney. It was a gas well that they just didn't get the pressure right. It blew, and it was like going like that for about 4 hours. There was no way you could control the pressure. It's really hard, once you get a blowout, to actually stop it. And then the methane study is a very famous study by the US Academy of Sciences, where it shows that if you live within a kilometre of a well, you have a much, much greater risk of having methane in your water. Impacts on the air, again, I've just started with one US study because it's the only study that has actually looked at air quality over a period of time. It looked at it for 12 months, why that was important, it was that it showed that the contaminants varied considerably. So you could test 1 week and find nothing. You could test the next week and find much higher levels. The other thing that was important about that was that it showed that the highest air pollutants were at time of initial drilling, not at hydraulic fracturing. So I think that's very relevant for the work that's being planned for here. We're involved in some the next study, which I think is probably one of the groundbreaking studies. This Tate and al. One was done at a university quite close to us. And basically it showed that and this is real world testing, it showed that the carbon dioxide, radon and methane were 3 times higher within the gas field than outside the gas field. And what it really was showing was that we weren't only getting venting fugitive emissions from wells, leaking wells, but we were getting these gases coming up through the soil structure. And so there was this interchange between soil and atmosphere that nobody really was aware of before. And so it's a very important study, and they're certainly doing some more work on that one. We were involved in the Tara estate air sampling. We did some testing, government did some testing, industry did some testing, and lo and behold, we came up with the same group of volatile organic compounds. These are quite serious. We picked up 26 all up. These are around people's houses. This is an estate where people have small agricultural holdings, and some of those contaminants are related, we think, to some of the health impacts, which I'll talk about in a second. I was also involved in a project that looked at 8-hour monitoring around some wells and came back with chlorofluorocarbons. They're the ozone depleters. They are being banned. We're not suggesting the industry are using them, but what we are suggesting is that these chemicals are being formed as byproducts of the chemicals that are going down the well. And the Queensland government did some testing of wells, and around 400, 120 were leaking methane. The image there is of the Condamine River, and about 6 months ago it started to bubble. It is bubbling methane. There's another photo of it. It's bubbling methane along quite a long stretch, kilometres worth. We believe what has happened is the integrity of the river base has been breached through the industry's work and basically releasing methane. The government and industry have said, oh no, it's okay, it's all natural. But when we've spoken to the farmers who live along the river, they've never seen it before, and their parents have never seen it before. So just the last couple on health impacts, and then I'll get to some more of the jollier stuff. The US has done a risk assessment, which is probably the only proper risk assessment in relation to this industry globally, and it has shown that if you live within a half a mile of a shale well, you are much more likely to have increased risks of respiratory and neurological problems and an excess lifetime risk of cancer. We have a community in Queensland, I mentioned the Tara community, who live on these rural estates. Of the 38 households, 60% are reporting health symptoms. They appear to be, when you read them, they seem all like, eye and skin irritation, headaches, nosebleeds, not the sort of thing you really worry about. But all I can stress is these are very serious, they are debilitating. So the headaches go on, the nosebleeds go on. These are quite debilitating symptoms. Bad enough to force the Queensland government to come in and do a health survey to see if they could work out what was going on. They used a lot of the testing that industry provided for them, which was pretty poor. But even with this and with the minimal amount of actually reviewing the people, they still came up with the conclusion that some of the symptoms were related to some of the contaminants released by the industry. That was not how it was reported in the media. The media reported a clean bill of health for CSG, but that is not what the report said. Why I put the Pennsylvania surveys up there is the similarity. One's coal bed methane, one's shale, but very, very similar symptoms because the air pollutants are very, very similar. And it's important to remember this just isn't humans, this is also livestock, wildlife, and for any farmers in the audience, I would really recommend you go and have a look at the Bamberger report, which talks about impacts on livestock, and I think it's a very important report. One of the things that upset us most about the report was that it gave no real importance about the exposure to children. We have a number of children in that community, and the WHO has come out quite clearly and said children are not little adults, they have particular vulnerabilities, their exposure at certain times, either in utero or as they're developing, can have lifelong impacts. And that was not taken into consideration when they did the tests and they did the assessment. They also did a whole load of things, like there was no cumulative assessment. They used testing on air when the levels they tested for were well above the actual health criteria levels. And so it was a pretty shoddy test, a pretty shoddy study. The doctor who treats the residents was so upset about it. She has done her own study, which will soon appear in the scientific literature, but you can get a copy of it from our website. It's up there. And her concern is very much for the children. We have 17 children under the age of 5. They have got a range of symptoms. The ones there in dot points are the ones she is most concerned about. Many of those are neurotoxic symptoms, particularly the paresthesia, which is the tingling and numbness in extremities. I've just only put one of the pie charts up there, but it shows that prior to the industry, none of the kids suffered constant headaches. After the industry came, 13% did, and there's a lot of other information in that report, and you might be interested in it. Okay, depressing part over. The jolly part. This is the CSG-free communities from my region. This was a march in a small country town where we live quite close to. About 37,000 people, 8,000 people turned out to march. That's how strong the opposition was. The Lock the Gate Coalition, which some of you may have heard about, is what's driving this. And it's a coalition of some of the strangest bedfellows you could possibly imagine. We have very conservative farmers, we have tourist guides, we have Indigenous people, we have fishers, we have the Country Women's Association, who'd never protested in their life but marched in that march. We have animal groups, we have what we call shock jocks, which are, you know, the people on the radio who really go and bang on about stuff. But what this group came together to say was, okay, industry, you may have your permission from government, you may have your license from EPA, but what you don't have is a social license, and we don't intend to give you one. How it came about is this wonderful gentleman there is called Drew Hutton, and he started off the Lock the Gate Coalition. It's based on a legal precedent which says, like here in the UK, where the government owns the mineral rights under your house, that's the same in Australia. So a company, once it's got its permit to explore or produce, has the right to force you into arbitration or into the legal courts to get access to your property. But what they don't have the right to do under a legal precedent, which was the Plenty versus Dillon, is they don't have the right to enter a locked gate which is signposted. So this is a process of making it difficult, time-consuming, annoying, and what it goes on to do is to really develop this gas field-free communities, which is based on the idea if one landowner locks their gate, okay, the industry can force him into court, force him into arbitration. But if 2 lock their gate, or 3 lock their gate, or 100 lock their gate, then it's a case of diminishing returns for the company. They can't force you all into arbitration. They just simply can't afford it. So what has happened is we have had moratoriums. We've had 3 companies pull out. Dart Energy, I hate to say, has come here. We've got rid of them. We were absolutely delighted. And I do apologise from the bottom of my heart that they came here. We've had companies pull out of Australia. But we've also forced the government into a 2-kilometre exclusion zone, which basically now means that a company cannot drill or hydraulic frack within 2 kilometres of a residential zone, which is defined as 1,000 houses, or agricultural infrastructure like horse breeding areas, vineyards, or wineries. And I apologise for everyone else who's heard the joke, but that sort of tells you what Australians really, you know, value. Booze and horses. That it worked. It works brilliantly. And so that's the first community that locked their community. And I'll just go through a little bit about how it's happened. What happens is you hold a seed meeting. That is, a few of you get together. You promote a public meeting. You get to know your road or your village or your street. You then hold a public meeting. You get given a kit or a survey and you decide who amongst you is going to walk down that street or this part of the village, knocking on every door, talking to people, no dropping something in the letterbox. It's literally going and talking to your neighbours. And when you talk to your neighbours, you get a CD to give them so they have some information about the issue. You discuss your concerns with them. You build community. You gather in those surveys. And if you get a certain percentage of those surveys, you declare your region CSG or gas-free. That just gives you an idea of some of the percentages that we've seen in our region. I think the lowest there is 95%. So 95% of that little village said, I don't want this industry in my region. I'm not going to give it a social licence. And look what happens when you do that. So they're the first 2 that have happened in our region. I could go on. But you can see what happens. You just lock down a region. Now, this doesn't have legal standing. This has moral standing. Companies do not like to go into these regions where there is absolute resistance. And no company has actually crossed one of those regions. So, I think I'll finish. Come on. You put up a sign, banner, declaring your region as gas-free. You then hold a ceremony. The woman in red is our local mayor. She's there. 8 of our councils have now declared themselves CSG-free. So she's taking those declarations, come together to show all the streets and all the areas that have basically declared themselves CSG-free. Again, can you imagine a company coming into that region? Okay. Many people stop there, and that's fine. And I don't know how you feel about this, but we've gone further. And basically, once you declare your region as gas-free, then people say, all right, we're going to protect it. And this was because we already had some companies who were in this region that had been declared CSG-free. And the photo there is of some young people with the spades over their shoulder. And every day the company turned up with their tractors and their bulldozers and tried to build an 8-hectare holding pond for their polluted water. And every night these kids went out with their spades and filled it in. Now, admittedly it was a process of utility, but could you imagine what it did for the company? They just hated it. But it's not only for the young. This is a farming community down in Grafton who hadn't gone through the process in time. They called for help of those that had locked their areas and said, we're desperate. The company's arriving, the drilling truck is arriving, what will we do? And who comes to the rescue but the Knitting Nanas Against Gas on their walking frames. But you might think they're very sweet ladies who only just turn up in their walking frames. Get a load of the next picture. This is the Knitting Nanas Against Gas at work. Up a tripod, knitting the web of life, basically stopping the drilling trucks coming through. The woman on the left is one of our Supergirls, Supergals Against Gas. They run around in these Supergal outfits, handing out information, going to blockades. These are, you know, when I say blockades, some people think of, I don't know, ferals and sort of wild environment. These aren't. These are very friendly, family-orientated situations. There's the police getting our Knitting Nana down. We work very closely with our Indigenous peoples because they don't want this industry at all. And what has happened was the company that were involved, or the 2 companies that were involved in these pictures, have now said, okay, you win, we're leaving. And they have pulled out. So in a way, we've won. So just thank you very much for listening.